Hooray. Okay. Am I still sharing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for being here. I guess I could back up a little bit. So last time, okay, well, let's go all the way to the top. Can I skip all the way back? Let's do this. Okay, yeah, so we're talking about code reviews. So we did the first part last week and didn't get through quite all the slides, so we're doing part today. I guess I can do a quick run through of what we went over last time. We looked at why we want to do code reviews. And most of the time was spent looking at what am I actually looking for when I do code reviews. So like just like tips for ideas for things to look out for. So it kind of bleeds into like how, right? So it's a combination of like, what are the actual subject matter things that I have my spidey sense out for, as well as like, how do I ask the questions as I'm going through the code review to like remind myself to look for those things. So we're going to go a little bit more of like the how stuff, more of like the nuts and bolts of that today. And there's just a slide at the end for resources. Yeah. So we went through all of this stuff, benefits of the whole team, reasons for doing a PR for yourself, reasons for actually doing a PR for other people. A big summary point for me, at least, is it's just a really good opportunity to learn more about the code base and sort of pick up helpful things from your teammates. Aside from like the like the more obvious elements of like, well, this is how you work together as a team to make sure everything works together. Yeah. I wanted to stress this slide again. You do not need to be an expert to review someone else's code. Once again, you do not need to be an expert to review someone else's code. It's a all skill levels activity. Just like with open source development, oftentimes people say, you don't need to know anything about coding in order to contribute, even just sort of like writing documentation or reviewing for grammar, everything helps, and like every step along the way, you could always be learning more, right? If not the technology, learn from like how things are set up in this specific code base you're working on. There's always more opportunities. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna move on. I feel like I beat that dead horse a bit. Okay. Question, ask yourself in review, and then we went to the code smells. If you're interested in going through all of this stuff, you should be able to go to the recording of last week's session where we went through all of these in more detail. Okay, and so we end up here with this slide. Like with the pep talk around not being an expert, this can be a lot, especially at first, to sort of take in and think about while you're doing code reviews. So you don't feel like you have to like do all of this stuff from the top all the time. Where am I pursuits tab? Here it is. It's just like any other skill. You develop it with time and experience. Just like you're always learning, I feel like you're always learning how to do code reviews too. I like to say with anything, start small and grow from there, right? So you gotta start somewhere. So I think at least with Vamos, it's been encouraging to see people doing more of just like pulling the code and running it. That's a great start. That's awesome. Like at the very least, you're pulling the code that someone else has done and seeing, like at least for the UX, like what they've done with it. So that's like I said, that's an excellent start. So the more you sort of get into doing it, I think you'll start to get a knack for oh, like this is something that I've seen before, or this is not something I've seen before, and so going from there. Um, any questions about that or any of the stuff we reviewed just now about the stuff we covered last week before I move on? No? Okay, great. I do have the chat line pulled up here, so if you do have any questions, I can monitor that as we go. All right, so let's move on. So like I said, last time we talked about what we're looking at here. There's more questions, but this is stuff for you as the developer before you put the PR up. And yeah, I think one thing that doing PRs for other people helps with is setting things up for your own PRs. So you learn to start anticipating things that people might pick out. And I think that helps with just your general coding skills, coding style, etc. So these are kind of things that I make sure to ask myself when I put a PR up. Firstly, is this actually doing what I want, what it should be doing? Oftentimes, it's really easy to kind of get lost in the weeds and start off doing one thing and then sort of follow 5 different rabbit holes and end up somewhere completely different. So it's a good idea to sort of check back in after you've come to like a completion. Well, thank you, maybe. A completion spot of like, well, let me take stock and see if this is actually doing what the ticket is calling for. Sometimes you might not be. So is it doing something else, or is it not doing enough? Is it not actually fixing the issue? Is it a bug? Is it doing too much? Like, have I taken on like a whole set of like unrelated refactors that might be better in a different ticket, or is this doing something completely different, like not even what we asked for? And if so, kind of like pivot and sort of figure out where to go from there. Dot your I's, cross your T's. So that's just like code style stuff. And to make sure you have the right indentations, you have your semicolons where they need to be, or don't have semicolons where they don't need to be, all that kind of stuff. I tend to be kind of a stickler for style, just because that's the way I am. So I definitely try to like make sure before I submit something that it's ship shape. And I think as annoying that stuff can be, I think it does really lend itself to having a maintainable code base, so that other people coming back to the code later on, are able to read it. Other people, including yourself. So think about it like setting up for yourself. Like, if I come back to this code in a year, am I going to be able to read it and figure out what's going on, right? Yeah. Another consideration is how big is the change that I'm making in this branch? You know, is this like a one-off like bug fix kind of thing, or is this supporting a much larger product? And that the answer to that then kind of determines sort of the scope of what you should be doing in the ticket itself. A good example is, let's say you're adding a new model to keep track of some sort of process that happens in the back end. But it's part of a much larger feature that is going to be built eventually, but we don't have the stuff for quite yet. Like if so you could go ahead and do all of the, you create the model, you have it in the database, and you could do all the CRUD for it. So if I ship that, what will the user actually see? In this case, okay, they'll see the CRUD for this model, but unless there's like the full product that's built up around it, like is this going to be useful for the user, or are they just going to be puzzled as to like what is this doing here? So especially with larger products, sometimes it's useful to do the work under the hood to get things set up for the ultimate launch of the product. But not actually expose the UI elements of that until like it's all ready to go. Because otherwise, you might like you might confuse the user, but you also might end up creating like a messy data situation that you have to come back and clean up. So, that stuff, that can also be accounted for, or should also be accounted for in the sprint process. And if we're not planning for that in the sprint meetings, then make sure to speak up about that with sprint planning or backlog grooming. But even if that's not the case, I think that's something to keep in mind, writing your own stuff. Yeah. Another question is, yeah, actually, let's go back to one of the slides. I forget which one it was. I think it was reasons for submitting a PR. Yeah, this one. Some of the reasons for submitting a PR, there's the obvious, like, we have to do it because we can't get merged unless someone else looks at it, right? So that there's like the obvious part there, but also, I think one of the ways I use PRs is to just like pose questions to the rest of the team or like invite comments. Especially if there are like multiple ways of doing something, it might be useful to just put up a PR to be like, we talked about this in sprint planning. I've been thinking about doing it this way, but we could also do it somewhere else. And so like putting up a PR with like that first way of doing something could be a way to like generate a conversation around like, well, this is what we could do, and here are the implications. Maybe let's talk about what other methods might work, something like that. So if I go back to that slide I was on, am I looking to get comments on the code as I develop it, or am I only really looking for like the ultimate review at the end? So if you're looking to get more of a collaborative approach, you could think about putting a PR earlier than later, and labeling it work in progress. Yeah, so that the other team members know that like, okay, like, that's something to look at. It's not ready to be reviewed fully yet, but maybe they're asking for comments. Yeah. So there's that. If you're installing any new packages or libraries, make sure to call that out as well. Oftentimes that'll show up in like a package.json or a gem file. That's definitely helpful for the PM to know, so that like after they've merged the branch, they can know to inform the rest of the team that they need to do an npm install or whatever to get that updated. And lastly, at least on the slide here, one thing that is helpful is there's a principle of leave it cleaner than you found it. If you're working in an area of the code that it was pretty messy to work with, and you needed to do some work to like figure out what's happening or to like set your own stuff up, it might be nice to put in a little bit of extra work to clean things up so that the next person who comes along doesn't have to do that same amount of work. So if we kind of distribute that effort across the tickets, that's a way to help pay down the tech debt that we might have built up, so that we don't have to go back through and do like a massive refactor. Sometimes, things are so bad that that's the only thing you can do is do a massive refactor, which at that point, that's a different conversation. But I think this is one of those judgment calls that like kind of get a feel for as you go. It's like the question of what in the code that is surrounding stuff that I've done here could I include in the PR, or what should be left to a separate ticket. Oftentimes, if you start tugging on one thread, you end up pulling 8 other ones, which lead to like 100 other threads. And so like that might end up being a cascade that you don't want to address in the current PR, so you can move it to a different one. But at least sort of being aware of like that as a thing that you could sort of, if the scale was right, include in the current PR. Yeah. Any questions about that? comments, concerns? No? Okay, cool. Let's move on. What's the next slide here? Technical debt. Oh yeah, great. So I've mentioned tech debt a number of times, both last week and just now. And I had a hard time defining it, so I looked up a couple definitions. Here's what I cobbled together. As the cost of additional effort that might be needed to fix things in the future after the coding or architecture decisions that have been made in the past. So basically, it's kind of an idea of like, as soon as you write code, you're making a marker in time. Like that code did not exist in the past, and now it exists. And going forward, the farther and farther along you go, the code that you wrote in the past, it's kind of like it's an encapsulation of what you wrote at the time, right? And over time, like there'll be new. Well, there's obviously going to be more code added, but there's going to be more. There might be updates to sort of how you handle things. There'll definitely be new versions of libraries that you're using. There might be updated user specs for the product. So kind of like, I know this is a weird analogy, but like in astronomy, like the starlight that you're seeing is from millions and billions of years ago, right? So like the farther away the star is, the farther back in time you're looking. It's kind of like that with code too. Like the older the code that you're looking at, it's sort of like a time capsule of the current state of the code base at the time that it was written. And oftentimes that code might not make sense with the way that the code base currently works. So as much as we might want to avoid it, like technical debt is kind of an unavoidable feature of just writing code in a constantly evolving code base. So like I said, we can't avoid it, but there are things we can do to sort of like make it less of a burden. So yeah, so actually I just can run through this point here. So it comes from a variety of sources, some of which can be addressed at the time you write it. Some of it is just sort of like, especially with Agile, right? It's like you're constantly iterating on the product. You're always pushing new features, you're fixing bugs, the code base is constantly evolving, right? So oftentimes, especially if it's a large product, you might have 8 different people work on the same thing at 6 different points in time, and depending on where the code base is at the time, there might be different approaches that are used. We might have implemented a new set of classes or components in the code base that do things in a different way, that we need to get things updated, et cetera. So like I said before, it's a good idea to see if there are ways you can like pay down the technical debt as you go, rather than letting it build up. Yeah, actually I mentioned the leave it better than you found it here. Great. I'm repeating myself before I even know it. Yeah. Like I said, like sometimes you just need to do the refactor. So a prime example of that, if y'all are familiar with the Vamos front end project, we are in the middle of kind of chipping away at a giant refactor of the way that code base works. There's been layers of different developers who worked on it with different understandings of how the architecture is set up. And with each person who's worked on a product, there have been layers of different ways of handling the data. And so we're now at the point where it's not very clear where the data is coming from in any particular component. So we are having to take a good amount of time to even just plan for or plot out like how things are working, and then plan for rebuilding it. So, it's not the greatest, but, at the same time, it's like I said, it's unavoidable at some point, So yeah, the more we can do in the moment, like as we go, to pay that down, the better for, I think, the whole team. So we can kind of keep a handle on it. I know it's kind of a jumble of stuff that I just talked through. Any questions about technical debt? Y'all are quiet today. Okay, cool. All right, let's move on then. Here's more of the nuts and bolts part of things. When it comes to, so let's go back actually. Go a couple slides. So you've gone through all this stuff, these questions you're asking yourself of your code before you put the PR up. Now you're ready to actually like request the PR. What do you do? Before you start before you actually make that request, I think it's a couple things to think through. Who would you like to review your code? Most often it's subject matter experts. So if you're on, say, the front end team of a project, you probably want to have the front end folks review it, especially if there's someone who's got more experience or more senior. Oftentimes that's probably a good person to go to. Sometimes, even if they're like more advanced or whatever, they might not know the code base, the part of the code that you're working in. Maybe there's someone else on the team who has just done a lot of work in that same area. Maybe it makes sense to ask them instead, because they're going to be more familiar with the code that you're working in. Or sometimes it's kind of the opposite. Maybe you want someone to review it who hasn't seen that code at all, just to get them familiar with it, or for whatever reason. So I think that those questions kind of they change PR to PR. So it's kind of like a case by case basis, but just questions to think about. There's obviously people like Ramiro and myself. We end up doing a lot of the reviews. I'm hoping, with these huddles, we can sort of move towards not having everything go to Tom, Ramiro, and myself. But yeah, I mean, that we're also around. You can ask the people directly, or if there's not anyone specific you wanted to ask, maybe you can sometimes ask in like the Slack channel directly. But I don't think we have a good consolidated process for that yet. So maybe you can be part of setting up the precedent. So yeah, once you've, so yeah, I guess this is a nice courtesy to ask the person directly. Even if not though, there's the interface, like when you put the PR up in GitHub, there's the reviewers section. It's nice to put in a request here, just like I have a screenshot, just to, like, 'cause like for me, like I'm going through PRs pretty much every day. And it's nice to see like if someone's requested you specifically here to know like, oh, they're actually like asking for my input. I know sometimes people will add your name in the description of the PR, but I don't know, this is just like my personal taste. I like to check this section too. Yeah. So other than that, I think it's pretty basic. See what else we have coming up. Oh, tips and tricks. Yes. So here, I feel like this presentation has been a lot of me reading text off the screen, which is not the best presentation mode, but I don't know, just like one last little slide of things to talk through. Yeah, just on a general level, keep it professional. Code reviews are hard, both for the reviewer and for the person being reviewed. And it can be a sensitive process, especially since I think part of what makes it so intimidating is it cuts directly to, I think, one of the sources of imposter syndrome, of like that feeling of like, I don't know enough, like I'm not good enough, I can't, like I don't have the skills or whatever. And especially with a team of your peers, I think it's a natural feeling to want to not, or to not want to like um, appear critical of your teammates. um, but I think that's also just part of, I think a large part of making code reviews part of the process is sort of like establishing them as not really a personal thing, but it's more of just sort of like looking at the code itself, so as the person reviewing the review, I think that's something to keep in mind. I think for the person doing the review, I think it's also nice to keep in mind, what the experience of being on the other side is like, and sort of like what would it be like to get this comment. Yeah. So it's kind of a tricky balance, because I think the more that we can sort of point out, the better the code is going to be overall. But also, like, don't be an a-hole about it, right? Like, be respectful. um, yeah, it's a tricky thing. Um, that said, PRs aren't just for like doing the review at the end of the writing a ticket, right? It's not just to get approval. Yeah, I like to think of it as a learning opportunity and a way to have a conversation around code. So more than just sort of like, oh, I need you to approve this so I can get it merged. Like I think one thing I want to foster is a culture of putting a PR so you can talk it through with your teammates. Um, One of the benefits of doing it through a code review is that it's asynchronous. So you don't have to get on a call at the same time. You can sort of like have a conversation back and forth, sort of in place, right? In the place where eventually it might get merged. And that's and it's also nice to have that in place so you can go back and reference things in the future. Like maybe you have a new PR that is corresponding with the conversation you had about an earlier one. So you can reference that earlier conversation in the new PR, right? So it's all part of the record. Yeah. One thing that I think is a good practice to try to strive for is try to be more regular about PRs. This is something that I'm working on all the time. Especially when I am writing more code, I try to make time in my daily schedule to do GitHub stuff. So that's looking for PRs that you've been requested on, and also making sure to respond to comments that have been made either on your own PRs or PRs that you've done for other people. That really helps to accelerate the pace of getting stuff reviewed and merged. And I know, like, I've been, not great at that at times. Sometimes it takes me a week to get back to things, but I'm working on it. I'm trying to instill that daily schedule as much as I can. I used to think that we've all had the experience of like, like had this branch sitting around for like a month, and like, why isn't it getting merged? So if we can do the PRs on a quicker basis, I think that helps everyone. The longer a branch sits on its own, the more likelihood that it might get out of date with the other work that's being done. So sometimes it might be so out of date that like you might have to just like trash it and write a new one, just to get that same change in place. So yeah, anything we can do to be more regular about doing the reviews, I think is helpful for everyone. And I mean, I feel like I don't need to say this again, but do not need to be an expert. It's an opportunity to learn, just sort of share code with your teammates. Yeah, okay, I'm done saying that. Okay, moving on. So resources, a lot of this stuff was kind of pulled from these two resources that Sinan put up. This Professor Michaela Greiler, I don't know how you pronounce her name. She's got some great materials. There's a couple of other resources that I was able to pull. This one's about Google's practices. I think a lot of it is specific to Google, which I don't think we want necessarily to implement here, but it's good to hear what big companies do as well. Yeah. So if you want more reading, yeah, there's where to go. Especially with like the code smell stuff we covered last week. This PDF was really good. There's a lot more stuff to go through if you're interested in other things to keep in mind when doing a PR. Yeah, so that's basically it for the presentation. Yeah, I ended up taking the half hour. So I was supposed to talk about Redux here, but I think we're going to save that for another huddle. So yeah, I don't have any other slides prepared, but I can definitely take any questions that people have. If you have any questions. I'm going to go back to the slide. Just to hammer it one more time. Cool. Yeah. Any comments if there are no questions? Is this helpful? Is this not helpful? Is there anything you want me to go over? Or yeah. Got a thumbs up. Cool. All right, well, thanks everyone. I guess unless there's anything else y'all want to talk about, I guess we can give you back 20 minutes. Cool. Yeah, I'll make sure to post the link to these slides in the interns channel. So I'll have access to that, and we should have the recording soon. Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, TC, for another great huddle.
Yeah, of course.